No fair, you've only been at the wheel 30 minutes. Phoebe laughed as she jokingly threw a bag of Chex Mix at her nut-brown-haired companion. Calvin held the bag close. Well, yeah, but it's only 30 more till we get there. Phoebe brushed her long black hair out of her face and sighed. Fine, but you owe me for this and the snacks, she said as she climbed into the black SUV the two had spent the last day and a half driving in. You know, it's your car. Doesn't mean I want to drive it after all yesterday, Calvin retorted, taking his spot in the front passenger seat, cracking open his bottle of soda, and pouring the Chex Mix into a bowl protruding from one of the cup holders. But that was all highway driving, you barely had to turn. Phoebe laughed, taking her own choice of bottled water and a granola bar, and rapidly consuming the latter before taking a swig of water and backing the car out of the gas station and back onto the road. You know, it's kind of crazy how far your parents are from your grandparents. I couldn't imagine living that far from my parents. Well, you get used to it. It's not something I hardly think about at all. It's just how it is to me, Calvin said as he awkwardly sat cross-legged, straining his seatbelt, and sucked on his soda bottle, holding it high above his head. Phoebe chuckled at the latter point. You look like a baby the way you're loving that bottle. Calvin blushed slightly, though not quite enough for Phoebe to see, and stared off into the suburban sprawl that staved off the desert surrounding it. Phoebe broke the silence. And why did you need me to foot those snacks? You were working at that game store all year. No comment, Calvin breathed, nervousness plain to see. Calvin, I don't really care, Phoebe said, a sincere smile on her face. I'm not so sure, Calvin thought, and quickly changed the subject. You know, I'm honestly a little surprised it's taken this long for you to get to my grandparents' house. With how much you've told me, it had better be good. Phoebe shot back, with a playful push on her old friend's shoulder. Calvin restored his perch. Well, we're coming up on it. See for yourself. With that, the suburban sprawl began to fade. Neighborhoods became more spread out in kind, and on a hill in the distance, a brick mansion with a twisted gate around it. Spires and gables, and despite the sandy surroundings, a verdant yard leading up to it. Phoebe pointed to the hilltop. Is that it? You know it. The black-haired woman laughed. Well, I'm impressed so far. Within a few minutes, the duo had made their way to the hilltop mansion, traveled through the open gate, and came upon the familiar old couple that Calvin greeted with a massive bear hug, and Phoebe in turn with a polite handshake. Calvin, how was the drive out? His grandmother, a tall woman dressed in the clothes she might have worn as a hippie in the 1960s, perfectly complementing her long, unkempt silver hair. Well, Grandma Mary, it got way boring when we left the mountains, just a bunch of nothing. Calvin sighed as his grandfather cut in. Well, that's why we live here, the grandfatherly man said with a smile. In contrast to his wife, he wore a simple powder blue polo and shaved his head. He looked stern, but simultaneously friendly. And I love it, Grandpa Victor. Phoebe opened the SUV's hatch and motioned for Calvin to grab his things. He wouldn't stop complaining about it. I commend you on your patience, Mary said, as Phoebe and Calvin grabbed their bags. Hey now, you two seem to manage, Phoebe answered with a laugh. Well, we're family, we have to. But that's the thing, me and Calvin, we've known each other for so long, we're kind of family the same way. Hey Phoebes, Calvin shouted from the porch. Let me show you the rooms. Calvin hadn't been kidding about the house. The foyer led out into a massive open room with twin staircases leading up to the next level, and a basement level to the immediate right. The marble floors contrasted with red carpet on the stairs, and across the way was a grand arch seemingly leading to no end of rooms on the main floor. To the right of the door was another staircase, down to a basement that Phoebe couldn't quite peer into. We're staying up here, Calvin announced as he ran up the stairs and into one of the multiple doors on the next level, motioning for Phoebe to follow, which she did, and only found herself more impressed. This one's mine, yours connects, Calvin continued as he, uncharacteristically, balanced his suitcase carefully on the ground with one pocket towards the bed. Phoebe in turn rolled her suitcase through the connecting room, which proved to be a bathroom with 2 sinks and saw her own opulent accommodations. Like Calvin's, it felt almost cavernous, a king bed against one wall opposite the door, and yet took up only half of that wall. Bookshelves filled with both books and strange curiosities took up the remainder. And more than that, the room had a television with game consoles, some older than either of the 19-year-olds, some cutting edge. To the wall to the right of the bed there was a massive dresser which could easily hold the contents of the suitcase, as well as a closet taking up the other half of that wall. Finishing the room was a card table with 4 chairs and a cubby under it, with board games to match. "I'm gonna get situated," Calvin shouted as he left Phoebe to her own room. The athletic young woman smiled. Calvin was still the kid he'd been since the two were toddlers, and yet, he still kept up with all the Genid stuff. The two had knocked out their first year of community college and got himself a part-time job by night. Though he didn't seem to keep the money from it. Spent it all on, well, something. In less than an hour, the duo had unpacked and had set to work figuring out how to spend the rest of the day. Grandma Mary and Grandpa Victor had given the two time before dinner to settle, and before long, they had decided on a board game. Specifically a childhood classic. Candyland. And just like that, I get to Queen Faustina. Calvin announced with a flourish as he showed the card he'd just drawn to his companion, moving his gingerbread token across the board deep into the trail. Phoebe shook her head. "Well, no way I'm coming back from that. How many games behind are you now?" The last statement was punctuated with a smug grin. Calvin seemed to miss the sarcasm. "I think 8. I should have been keeping track." "Well, we'll chalk it up to the deck," Phoebe said, as she drew a yellow, moving only 2 squares ahead. "What do you want to do first this summer?" Calvin asked, his attention span short as ever. "Well, I'm not familiar with this town. What do you recommend?" The conversation was cut off by a knock at the door, and Calvin practically tripped over himself to answer. Grandpa Victor smiled as he pulled his arm back. "Hey kids, Grandma's got dinner ready." Calvin perked up, noticing the smell wafting from a floor below. "Is it spaghetti?" "You bet," Victor said with a smile as his grandson and his companion both made their way through the hallway and down the stairs, Calvin bounding and cheering, and Phoebe quietly following at a brisk yet reserved pace. Some things never changed, the older man thought to himself. The kitchen, by Phoebe's eyes, was every bit as impressive as the upper floor, filled with implements as modern as she'd ever seen, centered around a proud, dark granite island, as well as a long wooden table towards a wall of tinted windows looking out on a respectable kitchen garden. Itself impressive in a desert. Phoebe felt a bit struck by it as she came upon the kind woman at its center. "Your house is just lovely, Mrs. Stone," Phoebe said, as she crossed over to the pot of spaghetti. "Please call me Mary," the older woman responded. "I like to think I'm not that old." She punctuated the second statement with a laugh. "Well, my apologies. It is lovely, though. I'll say it's my work now. I've had a full life, and through it all I've always craved something to work on. And now it's this house, making it all come together, from the foyer to the greenhouse and garden. Speaking of greenhouse, tell me what you think of the sauce. I made it from tomatoes grown right here." Phoebe made her way to the pot, only to have a familiar hand reach for the ladle at the same time. "Sorry," Calvin said, a sheepish smile on his face as he pulled back his hand. Phoebe feigned an aggressive stance. "How dare you?" she said with a laugh, her feigned anger giving way to an open, smiling pose, Calvin's initial guilt giving way to a smile of his own. "Go ahead, Calvin." The young man complied, helping himself to a generous heap before clearing the way for Phoebe, while the former began raiding the garlic bread. The 4 people took their share of food and soon sat at the opulent rectangular table, on either side of the center, the younger 2 on the side facing the room, the elder on the side facing the garden. "Phoebe, it's wonderful to finally have you back here again," Mary said with a smile. "Again?" Phoebe asked, confusion plain on her face. Victor laughed. "I suppose you 2 are too young to remember. You were both maybe 2. Calvin's parents took you both to visit. I think yours were on vacation." Phoebe shrugged. "I guess so. That was way too long ago." Mary nodded. "Well, I suppose this is the first time you'll remember it. Both of you were in diapers the last time Phoebe were in this kitchen." Bottled his emotions. He then walked deliberately to his door and opened it gingerly, closing it with the same care. "Now, how would someone do it if they were gonna do it to me?" Calvin thought to himself as he settled on laying out his still damp towel on his bedroom floor before crawling to his dresser's bottom drawer. Taking one of its bounty in his hand, as well as a bottle of baby powder, some scented lotion, and a single baby wipe extracted from a dispenser. Calvin then laid down on the towel and before setting to work took a moment to look again at the diaper in his hands. It was a babyish design, a positional print themed after lions, with a yellow stripe on the crotch to show wetness. Sure, they'd cost him a lot of his part-time pay, but in his hands they were worth it without any doubt. Calvin quickly rubbed lotion around his midsection before topping it off with a generous helping of baby powder, and taped the diaper around himself. He spent a moment looking down at the garment taped to his waist with a wholehearted delight and fascination, before being broken out of it by a knock at the bedroom door. "1 second," he called out as he scrambled for clothing, settling on a loose pair of soft furry pants and a long ratty t-shirt. "Are you really that comfortable with no clothes?" Mary laughed as Calvin finally opened his door, after about half a minute. Calvin shuffled his feet. "No comment. I was just thinking tomorrow, what would you want to do? Maybe that quirky art installation?" Calvin offered. "I always loved being able to walk through art." "Sounds like a fun time. Phoebe'll get a kick out of that, I'm sure." "Yeah, sounds awesome." With that, Calvin started to jump, but caught himself, worried that doing so might expose his diaper's waistband, and only stood on his toes. "Well, sleep well. You'll need your energy for it," Mary said, kissing her grandson's forehead and walking off. Calvin in turn went into the bathroom to brush his teeth, to be met by Phoebe there to do the same. Phoebe spoke first. "I can't wait for tomorrow," she said with a sincere smile. "I'm sure we've got lots to do." "Well, yeah," Calvin began. "We're starting in this crazy art installation. You can climb all over it and explore and—" Calvin began rocking back and forth and caught himself, worried that his diaper might be noticeable from a telltale crinkling sound. "Well, it'll be really cool." Phoebe laughed. "Well, I can't wait." After the two finished readying themselves for bed, Phoebe sat awake for a brief moment, still in a contented haze. Calvin was still kind of a kid, and yet she couldn't see that as a bad thing. He still found everything wonderful and exciting, even as their adult life loomed. Phoebe envied him. Calvin, after brushing his teeth, drank 2 glasses of water filled at the sink, and poured himself a third to sip as he returned to his own room. "Well, it kind of sucks I had to pee so bad earlier," he thought to himself as he began gulping down the third glass as well. "Maybe I'll wake up and pee, or what if I do wet the bed?" Calvin found the latter idea particularly thrilling, though his initial outlook was soon tempered by an anxious thought. How would he hide it? He hadn't quite thought that far ahead, yet there he was, in diapers, for the first time since he was 4. After some deliberation, Calvin decided to make that tomorrow's problem as he set the glass on a coaster, sipped it twice more and drifted off to sleep.